Now, in order for you to understand the marginal revenue curve and what it looks like, we're going to have a conversation about a few things that we've already talked about. Also, we're actually going to need to draw another graph that does not belong on the dollars per unit graph. And what we have here is this graph is the absolute dollars graph for a company or for an industry. Let's say it's for a company. This graph or this coordinate plane, I'm going to remind you where it comes from. Do you recall when we did break-even analysis? One of the things that we did was I showed you that we had an absolute dollars coordinate plane, and what we drew on that absolute dollars coordinate plane was we drew a horizontal graph which was fixed costs. And why is fixed cost a flat line? Because it's a constant. It does not change. As quantity increases, fixed costs do not change, right? And then we also drew on this graph we used linear graphs, but understand that they're not actually linear. We drew the variable cost curve, variable cost, and then we drew the total cost curve, which was parallel to the variable cost curve. And the reason that it was parallel to the variable cost curve was because total cost is equal to variable cost plus fixed cost, right? Okay? All right, so this graph up here is the total dollars that a company is paying out for their fixed cost, variable costs, or total cost. Whereas this graph down here is the dollars, these dollars, but divided by the quantity. If you are a calculus math person, this, for the most part, this is a derivative. Many of the things that we put on here are a derivative of the graph up here. That's why it's the dollars per quantity graph. Okay? All right, so up here, this graph is the total dollars overall paid out as, or what would be paid out based on the quantity that is produced and sold, where down here, this is the quantity per unit. Now, something else we're going to, and I'm not going to draw anything on here yet, okay? But the next thing that I need to remind you about is we have to go back and recall elasticity. In particular, we need to remember elasticity of demand. And there's two things I'm going to remind you about price elasticity of demand that are relevant to what we're about to talk about. The first thing I need to remind you is that typically a higher price leads to a higher elasticity. Okay? Which also means that a lower price on a product typically results in a lower elasticity. Or when I say lower elasticity, we'll say inelastic. Okay? So, inelastic demand tends to occur at a lower price, and elastic demand tends to happen at a higher price. And so, before I write the other thing, let's come over here to this demand curve. Remember that demand is a relationship between price and quantity. And so here's what I want to show you. When quantity is low, when we're all the way over here, when we're producing a low quantity over here, if we go up here to the demand curve, you can see that the price is high. So the price is high when the quantity is low. Why? Because there is a negative relationship between price and quantity on the demand curve. Okay, the demand is the negative relationship between price and quantity. On the other hand, a higher quantity, a company is only going to be able to produce and sell a higher quantity if their price is lower. So price low. So the price is going to be lower when the quantity is higher, and the price is going to be higher when the quantity is lower. So this low quantity is associated with a high price. I'm putting price. I know I wrote it sideways. I'm sorry about that. High price. And over here, this is going to be low price. Okay? So this region over here on quantity is the low price region. And over here on low quantity is the high price region. And I'm going to put a mark right between it, that over here we have higher prices and over here we have lower prices. Well, look, in a high price, when the price is higher, demand is more elastic. And so over here in this region, this is going to be the elastic demand region. And over here, this is going to be the inelastic demand region. And this line right here is going to represent unitary elasticity. Unitary elasticity. So here, this line right here is where elasticity equals 1, and this is where elasticity is greater than 1, and here's where elasticity is smaller than 1. The second thing that we learned about price elasticity of demand that is going to be relevant to what I'm explaining here is this. Do you recall that we explained that the elasticity or the inelasticity can affect the total revenue that a firm will earn if they change their price? And here's what we learned, is that when demand is inelastic, okay, when demand is inelastic, if the company raises their price, that will result in higher total revenue. So they can earn more revenue if they raise their price, but only if demand is inelastic. That also means that if they decrease their price, that total revenue will go down. That looks terrible. Let me rewrite that. That if they decrease their price, there will be a decrease in total revenue. So there's a positive relationship between price and total revenue, but only when demand is inelastic. Then we learned that when demand is elastic, that an increase in price that would result in a decrease in total revenue. Or that a decrease in price will result in an increase in total revenue. Okay? So when demand is elastic, there is a negative relationship between a price change and how much revenue is earned by the company. Okay? And so we are going to take this idea, and we're going to come over here, and let me tell you what I want to create a graph for. Okay? Up here, I want to create a graph for total revenue. I want to get an understanding of the graph, the actual graph that for total revenue that a company is going to experience. Because when we did this before, when we did it very rough, I told you that total revenue was going to be a kind of a straight line that kind of just shoots off into eternity, and that's not the truth. And the reason that I'm trying to draw a graph and get an idea of what total revenue looks like is because we want the graph for marginal revenue. And I want to remind you that marginal revenue is related to total revenue. That marginal revenue is the little bit of increase in total revenue. So how much total revenue, let's put this over here. Remember that marginal revenue is the incremental increase in total revenue by producing and selling one unit or the next unit of quantity. Okay, so the marginal revenue for the 17th unit is however much total revenue will go up if you produce and sell the 17th unit. Okay, and so this is what we're trying to understand. So in order to understand marginal revenue, we have to understand total revenue. In order to understand total revenue, we have to understand elasticity. And in order to understand elasticity with price, we're going to go to what we just drew up here a few minutes ago. Okay, so here's what we know. In this elastic zone, here's the most important thing. As we move from left to right, because that's how we're going to draw the graph. We're going to draw it from left to right. Quantity, we're going to draw it as quantity is increasing. And so now, as quantity increases, what is happening to the price? Well, as we go from here, low quantity to high quantity, as quantity is increasing, price is going from high to low. So what we have moving in this direction is a decrease in price. Decrease in price. So moving from left to right, we have an increase in quantity but a decrease in price. And that's because of the demand curve, because there is a negative relationship between price and quantity. So here's what we want. We don't want this one right here because we're going to be dealing in a decrease in price. And we don't want this one right here because we're going to be dealing in a decrease in price. And we start off in the elastic zone. So in the elastic zone, over here at the origin, that's where we're beginning our quantity. Quantity is 0. So over here, quantity is 0. And since total revenue is equal to price times quantity, that when quantity is 0, total revenue will be 0. So we know that our total revenue curve is going to start right here at the origin. When quantity is 0, total revenue, TR, dollars total revenue is 0. But as we start increasing in quantity, look, as we increase in quantity, we decrease in price. And in the very first region here, we're in the elasticity of demand is elastic. And when the price decreases, total revenue increases. So, from all the way over to this, through this elastic zone, and I'm going to watch what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to kind of draw a dotted vertical line. Here we go. I want to put that right there. Here's what you need to understand, is leading up to this line right here. Over here, demand is elastic, and over here, demand is inelastic. All right, so as quantity is increasing, price is decreasing as we move this direction. And in the elastic zone here and here, when the price is decreasing, total revenue is increasing. Therefore, in this region, this elastic region, as quantity increases, that means price is decreasing. That means that total revenue will be increasing. So we're going to kind of have an upward sloping curve in that region right there. But look at this. When we go over to the inelastic zone, we're going to be looking up here. And as price decreases, total revenue is going to decrease. So when we get over into this inelastic zone, total revenue is going to kind of be decreasing. One more thing. Do you recall that we also said that when elasticity is unitary, that any change in price, so a change in price will lead to no change in total revenue. And so no change means flat. And so at unitary here, we know that the total revenue is not going to change at all. It's going to remain flat. So here's what we have to do. We have to draw a curve that starts at 0, goes up, then it kind of goes flat, and then it kind of goes down. And with that description, here's what I'm going to show you our total revenue curve is going to look like. Okay? It's going to be kind of flat up here at unitary. It's going to be increasing from 0, and then after this, it's going to be decreasing. And what you see here is a basic idea of what the total revenue curve looks like for pretty much any business. Okay? This is the basic total revenue curve for any business. Now that we understand what the total revenue curve looks like, we can now understand what the marginal revenue curve is going to look like. So here's what I want to show you. Actually, I shouldn't say the incremental increase in total revenue. That marginal revenue is simply the incremental change in total revenue by producing or selling one more unit. Okay? It is technically the rate of change in total revenue. And for you calculus folks, it's important that you understand that the marginal revenue curve is basically the derivative of the total revenue curve, because marginal revenue is the derivative of total revenue. Okay? But if you don't understand calculus and derivatives, then ignore what I just said. So look at this. Here's what's happening. As quantity increases, right? As we produce one more quantity, so if we go from this quantity to this quantity right here, okay? From here to here, what's happening to total revenue? It's going up. So total revenue is positive. I'm going to put a little plus sign for positive. And then if we go up one more quantity here, let's say we go to right about the same horizontal distance here, we would go up and over, again, positive. And then if we go up and over again, here's what I want you to see. What I want you to see is that the increases are going to start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? The steps are going to, it's hard for me to, actually I shouldn't have done it like that, but basically the idea is, see this is bigger, and this is smaller, and this is even smaller. The increases in total revenue, they're still increases. Total revenue is still getting larger and larger, but it's getting larger in smaller chunks. If I were to put it in numbers, we could come down here and maybe say that down here, total revenue is like 10, but then up here, total revenue is, sorry, let me rephrase. Total revenue is increasing by 10 down here, but then around here, it's increasing maybe by 8. Here, it's increasing by maybe 5, and up here, it's only increasing by 2. And eventually, when we get up here and it becomes flat, up here, total revenue might at first be increasing by 1, but then here it's not increasing at all. And so it has a 0 increase. So the increase, the added on to total revenue could be 10, then 8, then 5, then 2, then 1, then 0. So these are all positive numbers. But if we graphed it down here, 10 is about maybe up here. Then 5 is down here. Then 2 is way down here. Then 1 is here, and then 0, actually I didn't quite get the slope right there. Let's see, 1 is maybe right about there, 2 is maybe right about here, and 5 is maybe right about here. And so what you're going to see is this, is that the marginal revenue curve is going to follow this pattern right here. And guess what it's going to be? As soon as it gets to this unitary point, it's actually going to be 0. Hang on, let me fix that curve a little bit. And what you're looking at here, this downward sloping line, I'm going to do a much better job. I usually draw it as a straight line, even though it doesn't necessarily have to be a straight line. What you're looking at right there is the marginal revenue curve. And then eventually the marginal revenue curve actually goes negative. Why does it go negative? Well, because look what happens to total revenue. Eventually, after this zero, after this high point, that's, by the way, this is the maximum for total revenue. Okay? And I don't know if you recall, one of the things that we learned about elasticity was that at unitary elasticity, total revenue is maximized. Okay? And so this is the maximum total revenue. And from this point on, if the company continues producing, their total revenue will go down. It'll get smaller. See, this, it's going down, so that's a negative slope. Okay? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? And that's why, in order to go from this high number, let's say that maximum total revenue is, I don't know, let's say it's 100. When it goes down to here, now all of a sudden it's at 90. Well, how's it going to go from 10 to 90? The marginal revenue would have to be negative in order for total revenue to go down. And that's why the marginal revenue curve would then be below the Q-axis in the negative zone. And I know I promised you we would only be in the first quadrant. And we will, because we're not going to be dealing with this portion of the marginal revenue curve. So when I draw the marginal revenue curve, I'll usually stop maybe right about there, because this is the part of the marginal revenue curve that we care about. Now, I know that that was a huge explanation. You may need to go back and watch this explanation again. But I did all of this so that you can understand that the marginal revenue curve is the downward sloping curve that is underneath the demand curve. So whenever you draw a market graph, if you were to do a coordinate plane with the dollars over quantity and the quantity over here, this is the demand curve and this is the marginal revenue curve every single time. Okay? All right, let's move on to the marginal cost curve.